So this is a video on how you can select any element on your page using the CSS selector, class names, or IDs. And this is a guide for non-technical people. So if you've been struggling with this is the video for you. I believe this is a foundational technique. To be honest, I'm recording this video for myself so I can reference to this from other videos, because this is something that comes back every time. For instance, if you want to track button clicks, every time you want to use a visibility trigger or a form submit trigger, but sometimes also in custom scripts or in A/B testing, selecting elements on a page is just something very foundational, and that's why I'm making this in-depth video about it. It's probably a little bit more in-depth than my usual video, but I think it's worth it because, as I said, it's a really foundational technique. All right, let's go. Welcome to the channel. My name is Leon. This channel exists to help you make better decisions in your daily work using your analytics data. If you like what I'm doing, please click the like and subscribe buttons down below. That really helps me get these videos out to as many people as I can. Also, if you like this video and want to watch more, there's a link in the video description to a playlist full of videos just like this. Alright, let's talk about the contents of this video, because this is gonna be a little bit longer video than usual. Well, the goal of this video is to help you select any element on your page, whether it's in a click trigger, in an element visibility trigger, or in a form submit trigger. I'm probably gonna be referencing from other videos to this videos also, but the goal is that you're gonna learn today how you can select any element on your page. And I'm gonna start by explaining some HTML basics to you, because if you're a non-tech person, you're probably not familiar with a lot of these terminologies, and I'm gonna do the least amount that is necessary. I'm not gonna overload you with all this technical information, but there are some basic things that you need to know. So that's the first thing that we're gonna do. We're gonna talk through some HTML together, and you'll be fine. It's not as complicated as you think. And then we're gonna talk through some Google Tag Manager triggers, because that's really what we're trying to use it in. So we're gonna talk through the click on link, click on element, element visibility, and the form submit. Where can you apply this knowledge? And then in the next section, we're gonna talk about how you can actually select a different element on the page. So we're gonna talk about selecting by class name. We're gonna talk about selecting by ID. We're gonna talk about selecting by the CSS selector, and that's actually very powerful. So I'm gonna share with you some basic techniques, but also some advanced techniques. And then at the end, I have some small bonus tips. So that's really the contents of this video. Let's start by explaining some core concepts of HTML. All right, before we dive into the rest of the video, I wanna go over some core concepts in HTML that you really need to know. Don't be afraid, it's probably gonna be a lot easier than you think. I'm not gonna overwhelm you with a lot of technical information, but there are some core concepts that you need to be familiar with in order to understand the rest of the video. So that's why I created a folder, HTML basics, with a blank HTML file in it. And I've opened up that HTML file in both a browser and a text editor. So everything I'm going to do in the text editor is going to show up in the browser. And the first thing that you need to know is that every page on the internet, it doesn't matter what page it is made up of HTML code. If I'm going to my own website here, what you'll find is that every page, as I said, is made up of HTML code. And you can look at that HTML code by right-clicking on your page and then clicking inspect. And then either it opens up from the bottom or it opens up from the side like this. But this is really the way that you can see the HTML of your site. Let's go back to our blank screen. And if you're going to study that, what you'll find is that HTML is built up of different tags. And the most foundational tag that you will find on every page is the basic HTML tag. This means that the document starts here, and what you'll find is that a lot of tags have both an opening tag and a closing tag, and the closing tag is signaled with this slash sign at the beginning. And what this really means is that the page starts here and the page ends right here. So every page on the internet has these two tags. And what you also find is that within these tags there are two sections. Again, every page has this. The first section is the head section, and here again you'll find that you have a beginning head tag and an ending head tag, and then underneath that you have a body section, and again you have an opening tag and a closing tag. Well, what's the difference between these two sections? Well, what you'll find is that Every page on the web has a visible part, which is the body, and an invisible part, which is the head. Well, let's go to my own site for an example. The visible part of the page, the body part, is everything that's inside of the browser window, everything that is actually visible on the screen. But there are also some things that are not visible. For instance, the title tag here. And if you're an SEO specialist, or maybe you have some experience in SEO, you'll know that every page also has a meta description. Well, those types of information are usually found in the head section of the page. So for instance, let's go into our Hello World document. You will see that this page doesn't have a title tag yet, but in the head section you will usually find a title, and then I'm going to just write Hello World, and I'm going to say title close. And if I'm saving it and refreshing it, you will see that the title of this page is Hello World, and I'm even can give this a description. This is the meta description tag, so meta name, description, content, and then I'm gonna rewrite this to this is my first HTML document. And this is the description that a lot of search engines use on their results page. Again, if you're familiar with SEO, you'll probably know these two tags already. So the head section is really the invisible part of the page. We're not seeing anything happen here, but it's the invisible part outside of the window. Here, for instance, this Hello World title and the description, but also some links to like markup, like CSS, styling documents, links to scripts, things like that. A lot of tracking scripts are found in the head section also. And then the body section. The body section is the visible part of the page. And again, if you're familiar with SEO, there are probably a lot of tags that you're already familiar with. For instance, the H1 tag. This is my first HTML document. The HTML tag signals that this is the main title of the page. And in SEO, this is also a really important element because search engines put a lot of weight on this element. So you probably want your keywords to be in the H1 title. And then also you of course have the H2 subtitle and H3 and H4, etc. And then you have your paragraphs. So I'm just gonna put in some text real quickly. A paragraph is just a small piece of text, and then if you have a new paragraph, you put it like this, and then maybe you have another subtitle, put it like this, and then a new paragraph. So this is how pages are marked up. And what you'll find is that a lot of these HTML tags have an opening tag and a closing tag. So the H1 has both, the H2 has both, the paragraph has both. And now let's take one step further. Let's insert a link. Inserting a link can be done with a so-called anchor tag, and it's abbreviated with the letter A. So it's really a short tag, letter A. And if I'm going to save it and refresh it, nothing really happens. And that's because a link needs to have a location to point to. For instance, if I want to link to my own site, I'm going to do href is, and then I'm going to put in the full address. Let's make it easy on myself. I'm just going to put in the full address to my site. I'm going to save this, refresh, and now you see that the link to this page shows up, and I'm going to click it. Yeah, there you go, it works. So a link on a page is usually an A tag with an href attribute. All right, those were some core HTML concepts. I hope it was clear. I hope you're not overwhelmed at this stage. Let's log into Google Tag Manager and look at some triggers that ask for an element as input. So I'm going into tags and I'm firing up a new tag. And let's just skip the tag configuration. Let's look at some of the triggers that are available. I have some triggers already set up, but if I want to create new triggers, there's a list here that gives you all the available triggers. So of course we have some page view triggers. I'm going to talk about that in a different video. But then you have click triggers. And then here there's a difference between click trigger on just links and click triggers on all elements. And if I choose the click trigger on just links, it gives me an option to filter on click on all links or click on some links. And when I say click on some links, I can filter it by click classes, click text, click URL, and then under built-in variables, we have even more options here. So click element is a good one. Built-in option click ID is a good one. So we have all these options of filtering down what links we want to track. And the same goes for click on all elements. So here you have, again, click classes, click element, click ID, click text, click URL. There are all these different things that we can filter down what exactly we want to track. So that's click on all elements. But then you also have element visibility. Element visibility is a trigger that kind of fires a tag as soon as some kind of element comes up. I've used this in different scenarios. One scenario is where you don't have a thank you page. So for instance, here on this page, I put this page together as a test. I'm going to say test.nl. I'm going to say send. And then this page doesn't take me to a thank you page. It just gives me this message. And this is where I would use a visibility trigger. So I'm just going to say fire up a conversion tag as soon as this element becomes visible. I've also used this trigger, for instance, for a cookie banner, for tracking the visibility of a cookie banner, or some kind of marketing pop-up. So newspaper sites often have these paywall constructions. So I have actually worked for different newspaper sites. And then every time a paywall would show, we would track that as a paywall visit or a paywall view. And I would use these triggers. And then here you have a selection method ID or a selection method CSS selector. So it's really asking for an element as input. And then also you have this form submission trigger. Again, you can just track every form submit, but again, you can buy like this. So this trigger fires on all forms, but then you can also filter it down. In this scenario, you wouldn't use click classes, click text, or click URL. You would use variables that start with form. So the variable name here, form element, form classes, form ID. These are the elements that you can use here to filter down all the forms. So if I want to track all the forms on my site, both the contact form, or I have some different forms, newsletters, the search bar is also a form on your site. If you want to track all the forms, you could just use all forms. But then if you want to filter it down, you need to select by, in this case, for instance, form ID, form classes, or form element. Alright, so now that we've gone through some HTML basics and talked through some triggers in Google Tag Manager that ask for an element as input, let's talk about how you can select different elements based on class name, ID, and CSS selector. And let's start with some easy examples. So for instance, here on my site, a common scenario would be that we would want to track all buttons. And if you want to track a button, there's an important distinction that we need to make. The first type of buttons are linked buttons. So if you click on a button, for instance this one right here, it links you to a different page. These are linked buttons. So if I right click on my element, I press inspect, the code of my page becomes visible, and then I already see the element that was selected here. And what we see here, if I remove the markup code here, I'm gonna remove it so you can see it. It's actually a link in disguise. It's just like we talked about in the first section, a regular link that is underlined right here. The only thing that makes it a button is that it contains some styling. So I made this site, I actually removed the underline, I made a background color, I made it round, I made it capitalized, I even made a hover effect so it behaves like a button, but underneath it's actually a linked button. And this is really important. Later on we'll find out in Google Tag Manager. The second type of button is when you're in a form and you want to submit the information in the form to that site. This is actually a different kind of element underneath. Let's inspect this. What we'll find here is that there are two types of buttons, but this is actually not a linked button. This is a form button. So let's put it real clear in this document. I'm gonna say linked buttons first. So we're gonna give some examples. Linked button. I'm gonna make a paragraph, and in that paragraph I'm gonna make an anchor. Click here. So a linked button is just a link in disguise, and usually it has some styling added to it using some kind of class name, and we're gonna use that later on. But what you'll see often is that it has class button or class BTN, and then often it has multiple classes, and class names are often separated with a space character. So for instance BTN blue, or it could also say button and then button blue or button large. I don't have styling here. I could, but I don't want to overwhelm you. But this is really how a linked button often looks in the markup. Then you also have the second type of buttons. It's the form button. This comes in two flavors. You have the input element, type is submit, and a value is click here. And if you don't style it, it looks like this. So again, on my site, I performed some styling on it, so it looks nice. It has some hover effect, but this is the browser's default styling. And this one comes in two flavors. So it might be that your site looks different. It might be that your site looks like this: button, open tag, and the closing tag, and then click here. So this way of writing a button in HTML is becoming a little bit more popular. So it doesn't really matter. It looks the same on the front end. So let's say we want to track clicks on linked buttons. Well, how can we do that? We're going to create a new tag. I'm going to skip the tag configuration for now. What I'm talking about today is how we can select our element. So I need to make a new trigger. I'm going to say click on linked buttons, and I'm going to say trigger configuration, and then I want to track clicks. And here I have the distinction: do I want to track just links, or do I want to track all elements? As a basic rule, I recommend that you use the click on just links, especially if you're starting out, because this works 99% of the time, and this needs a little bit more attention to detail and can fail faster if you don't know what you're doing. So if we want to track linked buttons anyway, we can just pick this one, because this will respond to clicks on links, on anchor elements. It doesn't respond to clicks on different elements. It responds to clicks on anchor, like href buttons. So just links. And then I can choose between this trigger fires on all link clicks or some link clicks. And then what we can do here, we can filter it by class name. And what you will find is that every site is different, but a lot of sites will use class names for buttons. So if I inspect this right here, it says button there and button primary. I can just say I want a class name, click classes, contains button. And then I've actually selected all buttons, all links on my site that have a class name that contains button. So this one contains button, and I also have this one at the top. Let's inspect it. This one inspects. Yeah, this is also an anchor element button, but I also have these menu items at the top, and this is also an anchor, but it doesn't have a class name. So my trigger here will not respond to clicks here because it doesn't have the class name of button. So this is the first and easiest way of selecting elements, is by using class name. And this also works for form submit triggers, but in that case you would need a form classes instead of a click classes, but the principle is the same. So the second way that I want to show you of selecting elements on your page is by using an ID. And again, every site is different. There's no single way of doing it. You just have to investigate how your site operates and then work based off of that. But what you'll find often, and I'm going to do it in my example document right here, is that some buttons don't have a class name, but they do have an ID. And it looks like this. You have an ID attribute, and then within that ID there's some kind of naming. So for instance, CTA button 123. An element can have only one ID, so you do not see like spaced with CTA button blue, for instance. So that's the first distinction between that and a class name. It just has one ID, and also that ID only happens once on the page. If you make a trigger based on an ID, you're only gonna track that element. You're not gonna track the button at the top and the button at the bottom. You're just gonna track that specific button. I do not have an example on my own site, but that's why I have this example document right here. If you would have that and you would inspect your element, you would see an anchor, a link with an HD. If you have this, your trigger could look exactly the same. We're still, by the way, looking at our linked button. So it's still this linked button. And if this is the case, if you have an ID on your button, you can just use click ID contains and then just copy your CTA button 123, just the contents of this ID. By the way, you only need to copy the value. It's just what's within the markers. That's the value that you're copying. So you can say, I want to track all the links that have a click ID that contains CTA button 123. So if your site contains a button that you want to track and that button only has an ID, this is the way that you can do that. So this is the second way of selecting elements on your page, is selecting elements based on an ID. And in many cases, these two work just fine. So you can just select linked buttons by class name, or if you do not have a class name, you can select it by ID. But there are also cases where you run into some issues and you cannot use direct class name or an ID. And let's talk over some scenarios. Some scenario is that your link, the link that you want to track, doesn't actually have a good name, but there is a parent element somewhere above, for instance this paragraph, and it's called for instance class article, and then it usually you would find it like this. It is not a paragraph in itself, but it has like a title, this article title, and then it has some kind of a paragraph introduction, and then it has like a button link. And sometimes they don't mark it up with a class name, but the parent element does have a class name. Well, this is a scenario where you're going to use the CSS selector, and it's really powerful and it lets you select every element on your page, but it's also a little bit more complicated. Another scenario where you probably want to use CSS selectors instead of class names or IDs is where you're not dealing with a link. For instance, these form buttons. So in the introduction, I explained the difference between link buttons and form buttons. And if you're dealing with form buttons, you cannot get away with the click just links trigger, because this trigger does not respond to any other element than just the links. So if we're tracking form buttons, we're forced to use the all elements trigger. And this trigger is actually a little bit more prone to error. You need to know a little bit more what you're doing. And if you're using the click on all element trigger, and well, you probably want to filter it down because you don't want to track every click on your page. That would generate enormous amounts of data, and it would probably overwhelm you. But if you want to filter this down, I recommend, just to be sure, that you don't use click classes, you don't use click ID, but you're using click element. So this is the second scenario where you do not want to select the element by class name or by an ID, but you want to select this element with the CSS selector. And this is how you set it up. Instead of using click classes contains and then the class name, or instead of using click ID contains, you're setting it up like this. You're using the variable click element, and if it's not there, you can just find it under choose built-in variable, and then it's right here at the top, click element. And then you're not saying contains, but you're saying matches CSS selector. And again, this is a little bit more complicated, but especially in these two scenarios where you do not have class name on the element directly, but you do have it on a parent element, or in the scenario where you do not have a linked button, but you have a form button that you want to track, I recommend, just to be sure, to use the CSS selector instead of the ID selector. Even if you maybe have an ID or a CSS name, I recommend it just to be sure that you're setting it up like this. So how would you set this up? Well, let's give some basic examples. The one here at the bottom is probably the easiest, so we're going to start there. If you're using click element matches CSS selector, you can do something like this. You can say, I want to match it to every button tag. And then you're just using the word. If you're just filling out a word here, it's going to look for button tags. You can also do all paragraphs, and it's going to track all the clicks on the paragraphs. Or you can say, I want to track the clicks on the H1. I don't know why you would do this, but this is how you can select tags. You just fill out the word, and then it's going to look for that tags, and it's going to track all the clicks on that element. You could even do this, body, and it's going to track all the clicks within the body, but that's the same effect as just tracking all clicks. You could also just look for a class name. So if your button has a class form submit, you could do it like this, form submit. And note that I'm starting out here with a dot signal. And a dot tells Google Tag Manager that we're looking for a class name. And it's going to find that class name for you, it's going to select it, and it's going to look for, and it's going to listen for clicks on that element, and it is going to respond to those clicks. You could also look for an ID. Let's say that this button has a form submit 123, and that's the ID. You would set it up like this. It starts with a hash sign, and a hash sign tells Google Tag Manager that we're looking for an element that has an ID with this name on it. The cool thing with this notation is that we can actually combine it. And why would we need to combine it? Well, especially in these cases, I want to tell Google Tag Manager exactly what element I want to track. And what we can do here, we can combine our first method by just selecting the tag, button, and let's say I have a class, form submit. I can say I want a button element that contains a class with form submit. So that way I'm making it even more specific. I'm selecting all button elements, but then only the buttons with a form submit class name on it. And this also works with IDs. So if I have an ID attribute and I want to say I want to select a button with this attribute, I can do it just like this. So one common scenario that I come across more often than not is that some buttons contain things. For instance, this one, I made it real quick. This one here at the bottom, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. But this one starts with an icon. I just picked an emoji because I'm a little bit lazy. And then I have some text, and then I have some arrows, and this could be also images. And if I'm looking at this button, I'm going to inspect it, just like we did before. I have the same button element, but I have elements within my button element. And if you come across this, sometimes this just confuses GTM. And then if you select your button form submit, it doesn't always work. Well, the great thing with this notation is that I can actually say I want button form submit, and I can say I want to select something else too. I want button form submit space, and then I say the star sign. The first line says I want to listen for clicks on the form submit, like on this parent element, but the comma says I want to listen for other elements as well. And then I say form button submit, and then the star says all the elements within the form button submit. So it's actually going to listen to this element, so the whole thing, but also to the separate elements right here. And this is a very bulletproof way of selecting the entire button element. I've come across multiple setups with Google Tag Manager where button clicks were only tracked when the click was happening on the text, but not on the icon or not on the arrow. We want to track the entire button, and this is the best way of doing that. I have also this scenario right here where I have a linked button. So I could do this. I could say I want to use the just links trigger, but we could also just use the click all elements. It's going to work just fine. And I don't have a class name on the link element itself, but I do have a class name on the parent element. Well, this scenario is really easily solvable also with this CSS selector. Again, it's really powerful. It's also a lot more complicated. You can just select about any element on your page without any problem. So how could we do this? I have it right here. This is the link we're talking about, and I'm going to inspect it. The link itself does not have a name, but the parent element that contains the title, the introduction, and the link, it does have a class name. Well, how could you do this? I'm going to say I want to select a link, and this line selects every link on the page. I cannot say I want to select the article, because with this notation we're expecting the class name to be on this tag itself. But I can say this. I can say I want to look for a class name article, like this. I'm telling that by using a space character. Within that element, I'm looking for an anchor. I'm looking for an A tag. And this is actually going to select the link within article. And if the article would have multiple links, it would select them all. There are, by the way, ways of just selecting the first link. I'm not going to go that deep into this, but this is the way where you can select a link by using a parent class. We could also do the same thing with this button element, for instance. So click here. So now I have an article element. This is not very common. Usually you would find this element only in forms. But if I want to track this, I could use .article button. And if I want to track them both, I can use a comma. I can say article button, and I want to also track article A. So one last thing I want to show you is this element right here. This is quite common. This is a form button. It's maybe a little bit confusing, but they are out there in two different flavors. You have the button element, but you also have the old version, which is an input type submit. And note that this is just an element that stands on its own. It doesn't have an opening or a closing tag. If you want to track clicks on an input type submit element, you would set it up like this. You would need, of course, a click on all elements trigger type, because it's not a link. So a click on just links would not work on this element. And then click element matches CSS selector. And then we could do it like this. First of all, we're starting out by using input. So this is going to select all the inputs. But if you're familiar with HTML, you will know that every input, for instance, this text input, this email address input, this text area, these are all inputs. And we only want to track clicks on the button. So we would need another line. Well, what we can do here is we can say opening bracket, closing bracket, and then we can say type is submit. This is called an attribute selector. This is another very powerful thing that you can use in all kinds of scenarios. If you want to know more about attribute selectors, there's a link in the video description to a great article on CSS tricks that I reference very often, that has gotten me out of trouble a lot of times. But without going too deep into that subject and attribute selectors, this is how you select input submit elements on your page, by saying click element matches CSS selector input, and then between brackets type equals submit. Alright, before we close out the video, I want to give you one more bonus tip. In my trainings, I often tell people that you can go very far with Google Tag Manager without any technical knowledge. I've seen countless people do it. They don't know anything about HTML and still get a lot of mileage out of Google Tag Manager. But if you want to make Google Tag Manager your profession, or maybe a large part of your profession, I recommend that you learn at least some of the basics in HTML and CSS, and perhaps even JavaScript. So I know some books, sites, YouTube channels on the topic. I'll put some links in the video description, but there are countless good trainings out there that you can find just by typing it in Google. But I really recommend that you learn some of the HTML, CSS and JavaScript if you want to take this even further. Alright, that's it for today. I hope this video was clear. I hope it was helpful. If you like this video, please click the like and subscribe buttons down below. That would really help me get this video out to as many people as I can. Also, if you want to watch more of my videos, there's a link in the video description to a playlist full of videos just like this. I hope you'll have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.